Personal identity is a big topic in philosophy, especially in metaphysics, but not limited to metaphysics. Actually, philosophy of mind within metaphysics is one of the biggest things personal identity connects with, but it's also a topic relevant to ethics. It's relevant to theology. It's not even just philosophy. Personal identity is a big topic in philosophy and in some other areas. Let's look at some things and get a working introduction to the area, to the questions of personal identity. The first thing to keep in mind is that we're not just dealing with one question when we talk about personal identity. We're dealing with several questions. The single most common question probably is what we call the persistence question. The Plato.Stanford reading on personal identity is very good on this topic. This is recommended reading for anyone interested in the topic. The article on personal identity at plato.stanford.edu, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, introduces the problems, plural, of personal identity. There's not just one question here. There's a lot of questions that are loosely connected. There's the who am I question. There's the what is a person question. And then there's the persistence question. What does it take for a person to exist over time, to survive changes and still be the same person? And there's questions about what sort of evidence is relevant to questions like the persistence question. There are other questions, and one of them, the what am I question, I think is quite good. And then there's the question about what matters. And I'm sure that's not a complete list, but those are some of the major questions. And this particular reading is very good on introducing the questions. Let's clarify my notes. These are drawn from my lesson plan. So let's specify what they're referring to. Now, I think usually the persistence question is going to be the big one, and that's what this particular reading focuses on. But there are other foci. I, in particular, am very interested in the question, who am I? Perhaps more than I'm interested in the persistence question. And probably the remainder of these notes will focus somewhat more, maybe just a little bit, the remainder of this video and the notes they are going over will focus somewhat more on the who am I question than on the persistence question. Now, before looking at the delightful thought experiments, to get a slightly better introduction to the question of personal identity, questions of personal identity, let's keep in mind that there are always ethical questions following pretty closely on questions of personal identity. Usually they're bioethics questions and questions about abortion, euthanasia, things like that. When is it okay to withhold medical care from someone who is apparently brain dead? That is a moral question to which questions about personal identity are relevant. And what exactly is a human being anyway? And are all human beings persons? All of these questions that are relevant to ethics are also relevant to metaphysics. Metaphysics is relevant to ethics. That's how philosophy works. That's how thought works. That's how life works, actually. Now let's look at some of the relevant thought experiments. This one is a personal favorite. In this particular situation, you're told that this guy Irwin has gone through this surgical procedure where his brain has been switched with that of a duck. And the result, according to Gary Larson, author of The Far Side, this is a wonderful Far Side cartoon. Gary Larson tells us that the duck, with his new human brain, went on to become the leader of a great flock of ducks. Irwin, ostracized by his family and friends, eventually just wanders south, and here's Irwin saying, quack, 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 because that's all he can say with his duck brain. So according to Gary Larson, this is Irwin. This is not Irwin. This is a duck with a new human brain. Now, he seems to have Irwin's memories. He says, where am I? Professor Sutton, what's going on around here? Have I been asleep? But apparently, That's not Irwin. No, no, this is Irwin, according to the Gary Larson account. Now, let's check this one. This is not a personal favorite. A good philosophical thought experiment, but I did not enjoy this half as much, or even less than half as much. I enjoyed this well under half as much as I enjoyed The Far Side. I had to read this in 10th grade, and I did not enjoy it very much. But the philosophical thought experiment is fairly good. Actually, it's very good. And this girl is in a car accident. If I remember correctly, it's a car accident. She's going to die. And so what do? They transfer her to a chimpanzee, where they transfer her memories and her thought patterns to a chimpanzee. They transfer, so to speak, her mind to a chimpanzee. Not strictly speaking, her brain. What they do is they transfer brain patterns and memory, according to this Wikipedia account. If I remember correctly, there's a lot of talk of neurons, transferring neurons in some way from the human brain to the chimpanzee brain, similar to the Irwin duck transformation, except the human body dies because, well, that was the whole reason they did it in the first place. The car accident was fatal. And technically, they're not switching one brain and another brain. They're moving patterns from one brain into the other brain to replace the old chimpanzee brain patterns, or brain arrangement, structures. I hardly know what words to use, but they transfer the characteristics of the brain without transferring the brain that make Eva who she is. And so now she's living in the body of a chimpanzee, where previously she'd been living in a human body. So according to this thought experiment, according to this particular book's version of the thought experiment, this is apparently the same person. It looks like Eva is the chimpanzee now, whereas Gary Larson suggests that Irwin is the old human body with the new duck brain. So who's right? That is a good question. Now, here's a question inspired by John Locke. We'll get back to sci-fi in a moment. Well, to other sci-fi. This is also sort of sci-fi. Let's hypothesize. God exists. There is life after death in some fashion. Set aside technical questions in Christian theology. Technical is the wrong word. Set aside the actual precise teaching of Christian theology, where there is actually a bodily resurrection. Life after death is something like, well, at the topic of maybe 3 sentences in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the eternal state is the embodied state. Heaven comes down to earth in Revelation chapter 20, 21, somewhere thereabouts. The resurrection of Christ, the bodily resurrection of Christ, not the soul fluttering off to heaven, but the bodily resurrection of Christ is the prototype of the resurrection for all people who are in Christ. The soul may continue after death, but it does not continue after death apart from the body long term. It's reunited with the body at the resurrection of the dead in the last days. That's technically the biblical teaching. Set all that aside. Go with a very simplified theistic picture. God exists. There is an afterlife. You will be punished for your sins or rewarded for your righteousness, or at any rate, there will be some form of justice in the afterlife. Stipulate that for the sake of the thought experiment. Now, also stipulate this particular mad scientist who has committed various crimes, perhaps some murders, knows these things, and he fears punishment after death, and he's dying. So instead of very sensibly repenting of his sins and begging God for mercy, he comes up with a way to escape from God's punishment. He kidnaps you, and he assumes you, in your innocence, have a soul that will go up to heaven. He, in his guilt, has a soul that will be sent down to hell. But if he first switches your person with his person, keeping the souls in place, then he will go up with your soul to heaven, which was formerly your soul. And you will go, you having been switched over from one soul to the other, will go with his soul down to hell. He plans to switch your memories with his. He has the machine. Perhaps he's also a magician as well as a scientist. He knows how to switch memories from one soul to another. He's not switching soul. He's not switching brain, one body to another. He's not even switching soul, one brain to another. No, he's switching memories, one soul to another. The souls stay in place. The brain and body, those also stay in place. What switches is the memories. And he thinks that memory is where personhood is. He thinks that the person who goes up to heaven with his memories will be him. The person who goes down to hell with your memories will be you, and thus you will escape God's punishment. The question then that this thought experiment gives us is he right? Which soul actually goes to hell? Now Locke's view is that personal identity goes with memories, not with bodies, not even souls. Evidently, this is the mad scientist view as well, but the difference between him and Locke is that Locke would say that God understands this. And if hypothetically all the things in this thought experiment came to pass, the soul with the memories of the murders is the one that would go down to hell. In Locke's thought experiment, God will send the soul that remembers crimes to hell in this thought experiment. God will send the soul with the memories of a righteous life up to heaven. Now, that's the simplified theistic picture. That's the thought experiment. That's Locke versus the mad scientist. So one important question is this mad scientist right, or is Locke right? And are they both right in what they say about memories? That's one question. Another question, are they right? One question, are they both right about personal identity going with memories, not with bodies, not even with souls? Second question, which one of the two, Locke or the mad scientist, is right? If personal identity does go with memories rather than with bodies or even with souls, which one is right about which soul God will punish? Presumably God will punish the right person and reward the right person, or reward the right person, punish the wrong person. But which one is the right person? Is it correct that is Locke correct that God will punish the person with the memories doing those evils, and will not send to hell the soul that originally was involved with those evils, but only the soul that remembers them now, that being where personal identity goes? But another question, does this even make sense? What is soul anyway? Now, one way of taking this question is to just question the parameters of the thought experiment. What is soul? Is there such a thing? What if there is no such thing as soul? Or what if we don't even know what it is? Well, that's one question. Another question is, as one of my students suggested when discussing this thought experiment last week, what if, in fact, a person's actions have an effect on that person's soul? What if you can't just switch memories from one soul to another and assume that that's where personal identity goes? No, the soul is affected by its own behavior, and the soul itself is corrupted. It's not just a vessel for memories, it's corrupted by its sins, or perhaps purified by its good deeds, or perhaps, if we step back towards actual Christian theology, purified by the grace of God primarily. All right, here's another thought experiment that I like. Let's not use the URL there. Let's just find a nice picture. All right, spoiler alert, if you care, if you haven't watched this TV show, stop watching now. In the TV show Travelers, the future is a mess. The world's a disaster. But the few survivors have figured out time travel, but they don't send bodies back. They don't even send brains back. And you don't say, strictly speaking, they send souls back. They do send people back. What they do is they send back minds, or they send back consciousness, or they send back memories, intentions, personalities. What they do is they take someone from a future time and send that person's memories, personality, commitments back in time to the brain of someone in an earlier time. So they, in the process, overwrite the previous person. The person's personality is overwritten, the person's intentions are overwritten, and in fact, they die in great pain. They have a splitting headache for a few seconds as their consciousness is being overwritten by the time traveler from the future. But the future knows when people were going to die. They know this from history. So they send them back in time right to a few seconds before someone was going to die anyway. They kill a person off a few seconds early, and then knowledge of how that person would have died, the new consciousness coming in from the future, prevents that death, and takes the role of that person in this particular century, in our time, assumes the identity of that person in our time, so to speak, assumes the identity, but is that really the case? That's the question we have to deal with. So Agent McLaren. McLaren is an FBI agent. He's going to die. The future knew how he died, so they sent one of their agents back in time to overwrite Agent McLaren, and Agent McLaren dies just a few seconds early, but now there's a new person, the person from the future, or there's, well, a different person, but the old person, but old with respect to where he came from. He came from the future, new with respect to time. The new person from the future comes in and occupies the body of Agent McLaren, and then lives with the name, with the job, with the wife of Agent McLaren, eventually learns to love this woman, and actually eventually accesses a lot of the memories of the original Agent McLaren. So who is this guy? Is he Agent McLaren? Is he the original Agent McLaren, or is he the new guy from the future, or is he some third guy? Now let's use the terminology I think they use on the internet when describing these situations. 1.0, 2.0. Marcy 1.0 had a brain condition. Her brain wasn't working properly. History didn't know this, but it did know when she was going to die, so they sent back someone from the future to occupy Marcy's brain and body. So Marcy 1.0 dies. She's overwritten by Marcy 2.0, who comes in from the future. And then at the end of season 1, I warned you, spoilers, at the end of season 1, assuming my memory is correct, it's been a couple of years since I watched this, at the end of season 1, Marcy 2.0 is going to die because of these brain problems. Her brain can't handle the new consciousness from the future. So what can you do? They figured out in the future how to save Marcy 2.0. What they do is they kill her. You save her by killing her, by overwriting Marcy 2.0 with the same consciousness from the future. Now that consciousness is sent back to a different time. It's the same mind being sent in from the future, but it's going to erase Marcy 2.0, who's been living in this time, living in this body, living with this name, Marcy, for a few months. So you have Marcy 1.0, Marcy 2.0, now we have Marcy 3.0, who comes in from the future. And Marcy 3.0 had the same consciousness as Marcy 2.0 at the moment Marcy 2.0 was sent back, but a different consciousness from Marcy 2.0 after Marcy 2.0 had lived in this body and assumed the role of Marcy for a few months. So which one's the real Marcy? Or are they all the real Marcy? Are they all the same person? Are these three different persons? These are good personal identity questions. And this show does a great job connecting the metaphysics questions of personal identity to the ethical questions. Because at the end of season 1, you have the question, is it right to save Marcy by overwriting the current Marcy with a new transferal of the original Marcy 2.0 consciousness from the future? Terribly confusing metaphysics. And the ethics might be confusing as well. At any rate, the ethics is very interesting. Now, I would go with a simple Kantian answer. I would not approve of it. Marcy 2.0 doesn't approve of it either. As I recall from season 1, she doesn't want to go. She doesn't want to be overwritten. And when someone actually does it to her, it seems almost like murder. But at the same time, it's the only way to save any Marcy. So it's terribly interesting and perhaps somewhat confusing. This is a wonderful thought experiment, a wonderful philosophical thought experiment illustrating personal identity issues. Now let's look at some of the major views on personal identity, and that's how we'll wrap up this video. Now let's start with some views focusing on the persistence question and drawn from the Plato.Stanford reading. An earlier version of this article, before certain revisions in 2019, referred to one answer as, well, not one answer as such, but one way of answering as the somatic approach. Now it refers instead to brute physical views. And then there's also the psychological approach, and there's the anti-criterialist approach. Now this particular reading actually will go over 4 different perspectives, 4 different strategies. Let's briefly look at 3. You can on your own time review 4, and then after covering 3 from this reading, let me look at several other approaches to the personal identity question or two, the questions of personal identity, including the persistence question, but a little bit more the who am I question, because I'm interested in that one about as much as I'm interested in the persistence question. All right, so the psychological continuity approach says that personal identity, in particular with respect to existence over time, involves some psychological thing, perhaps memories. The most famous psychological continuity approach to personal identity is John Locke, who says personal identity is in the memory. Now, there's a famous objection to John Locke we call the famous general objection. It's an objection associated with Thomas Reid. In this objection, consider a person who is at age 20, a lieutenant in the army, who remembers being a child. Based on memory continuity version of psychological continuity approach to personal identity, this lieutenant is the same person as the child he remembers being, but at age 50. Let's say he's a general who remembers being a lieutenant, but has now forgotten what it was like to be a child. So by the same theory, it appears he's not the child, but he is the lieutenant, and the lieutenant is the child, so he both is and is not the child, ergo contradiction. Therefore, this theory must be wrong. It leads to a contradiction. Whatever theory leads to a contradiction is wrong. So there's something wrong with this theory. Now, this doesn't mean that there's no way of having a psychological continuity theory. Psychological continuity theories have been dealing with this objection for a few centuries now. It's not exactly like there's no psychological continuity theory that's viable just because this objection exists. Rather, this is an objection showing you one of the potential difficulties with an approach like this, and pointing out the direction in which a theory along these lines is going to have to be carefully articulated in order to be able to deal with such objections. Now, physical approaches might say that personal identity is in the body. And again, this is outlined in the reading. Persistence consists in some sort of brute physical relation. You are that past or future being that has your body, or that is the same biological organism as you are, or the like. This would seem to be the approach of Gary Larson when he suggests that Irwin is the old body, not the duck with the new human brain, even if the duck is the one with Irwin's memory. So Locke says that is Irwin, the duck with the memories of Irwin is Irwin. This is not Irwin. Gary Larson, taking a somatic or physical approach, says, no, this is Irwin, even if he has the memories and the brain of a duck. All right, and another approach, I'll skip over narrativism. You could consult it as a fourth alternative view. We don't have time to cover everything anyway. This is a very brief introduction to a very big topic. A fourth view in this reading, a third view for this video, is anti-criterialism, which does not agree that there is something that it takes for us to persist. There may not be a single necessary and sufficient condition, maybe not even a single set of necessary and sufficient conditions for a person to exist at one time, and for the same person to exist at another time. Physical continuity, e.g. Irwin's body at one time and Irwin's body at another time, or psychological continuity, e.g. Irwin's memories at one time and Irwin's memories at an earlier time, may be evidence for persistence over time, but they don't guarantee it. So maybe there's no way of saying definitively which person here is Irwin, or even which one is a person. But that's a separate question. What is a person? Okay, so the reading will introduce these things. I've now briefly introduced the idea of these readings. I have mentioned that the reading will point to some characters who hold these different views. And I also mentioned from the history of philosophy 2 prominent materialists who I presume probably take a physicalist approach. Though I'm not guaranteeing this. I've not honestly read all that much Hobbes. I'm not sure I can say for sure he has this particular view of personal identity. I've studied other aspects of Hobbes' metaphysics. I haven't gone into enough detail to guarantee it. This is a provisional classification of some philosophers. Now let's talk about some other approaches, other philosophers. There's a skeptical approach. Some will say there's really no such thing as personal identity. Or there's really no one person that continues over time. Maybe there's one person at one time and another person at another time, but not the same person over time. What are some of the major skeptical approaches to personal identity? David Hume has a bundle theory of personal identity. He thinks what you are is just a bundle of perceptions. Now, John Locke had, in recent philosophical history, described material substance, physical substance, as something that has properties. There's a physical substance behind this teacup, but every single physical property, not only temperature and color, but also size and shape, are not the same thing as the substance. The substance is what has the size, the shape, the location, the color, the temperature, and all these other things. But the substance of the teacup itself, which has these properties, which underlies these properties, the substance itself is not knowable. It is a thing which has properties. You know it's there because something must have these properties. But the substance itself, well, you don't know what it's like. You just know it's something that has properties. Now, Berkeley had responded saying, well, if substance is this, quote, inconceivable somewhat, end quote, just get rid of the idea. What we should say is rather that the teacup is just this bundle of all those properties, size, shape, temperature, color, location, etc. All of these properties join together or make the teacup. There's no substance underlying the property. The only substance is mind. So basically, you can understand Hume's approach this way. Hume is doing for Berkeley's spiritual substance, mind, what Berkeley had done for Locke's substance, Locke's physical substance. He's eliminating it. Now, there are possible questions, possible objections along lines such as this. What actually does the bundling? The self is a bundle of perceptions. The Buddhist view, I believe, is rather similar. Now, I myself am not competent to go into any detail on the subject, but I think this book, Buddhism as Philosophy, by this particular character, Mark, I'm honestly not sure how to pronounce it, Mark Sideritz, perhaps. This guy, this book by this guy is probably a very fine introduction to the topic. And then there's eliminativism in contemporary analytic philosophy. Now, eliminativism says things don't exist. Going back to the teacup, the eliminativism of physical objects will say the teacup does not exist. All there is here is the particles. There's the atoms, or more precisely, the smallest particles. Whatever the atoms are made of, the atoms don't exist either. Things made of parts don't exist. There's no teacup, there's no molecules, there's no atoms. The only things that really exist are the little particles. That's eliminativism for metaphysics of objects, physical objects, teacups, and so on. And eliminativism for mind is different. It will say the mind does not exist either. Not every eliminativist in one category is necessarily an eliminativist in the other category. Some people are eliminativists for teacups, but not for minds. I believe Peter Van Inwagen is in that category. Don't quote me on that. Eliminativism for philosophy of mind does exist. And it corresponds nicely, I believe, to the Buddhist view and the Humean view. And I believe these are names of three eliminativists, the Churchlands and Unger, not to be confused with Eric Unger, my high school trig teacher. Now, there's a moral approach to defining personal identity, which I think would be the Confucian view. Who am I? To answer that question, you have to look at your duties, your obligations, your relationships. And there's spiritual approaches. Personal identity is in the soul. Descartes, as well as I can understand him, says the soul is the same thing as the mind. It's independent of the body. It is a thinking substance. It continues after death. Now, the human being is not the same thing as the person. What is a human being? What is a person? And who am I? These questions are not all answered in exactly the same way. Who are you? You're the soul. What is a person? It's the soul. Those questions have the same answer. But what is a human being? It's person plus body. Socrates in Plato's Republic has that approach hinted at earlier in this video. The soul is affected by our behavior. Good and bad behavior corrupts or heals the soul. That's books 2 through 9 of Republic. Book 10 of Republic suggests that the soul goes on to the afterlife. The soul is where personal identity is. And that is what we take with us when we die. And this, my friends, is one interesting way of connecting books 2 through 9 with book 10 of Plato's Republic. Finally, with extreme brevity, I am running out of time. I'm going to be late for a Zoom meeting if I don't wrap up this recording. There is another approach, which I'd rather call the theological approach, at least until I can come up with some better terminology, maybe someone else's terminology and I haven't come across it yet. The soul-based approach, we could call the spiritual approach, and the theological approach would go maybe a little further. It's very likely to talk about souls, but it's going to say personal identity is determined in some fashion by a relationship with God. I believe there's a worship song sung in church these days that goes, that has a line along the lines of speaking to God, I am who you say I am. Well, in the New Testament, personal identity does seem to be determined by my connection to Christ. Look at passages in Colossians 3 in the New Testament. And it's by the church's connection to Christ. It's not strictly speaking on an individual basis. When Paul says, I think I'm going to be trying to quote here from the ESV, English Standard Version, when Paul says, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ on high. When Christ who is your life appears, then you also will appear with him, etc., etc. He's using plural pronouns. You, plural. You guys, when y'all, in Texas terminology, when y'all die, y'all will appear with Christ. Y'all have died. Y'all's life is hidden with Christ. Personal identity is on a communal basis, and it's found in Christ. A mainstream, perhaps dreadfully oversimplified account of Hinduism will say that Atman is Brahman. Personal identity is Atman, which you could think of as roughly corresponding to the soul. But Atman is understood in relation to Brahman, the God who is everything. And then let's go to Augustine. In Book 1 of De Doctrina Christiana, he says, this is the passage where he talks about the golden rule. We do not need a commandment to love ourselves. We got that right. We did need a command to love God and to love our neighbors. In this passage, Augustine first suggests that what you are is the soul. Sounds like a personal identity is in the soul line. But then he says, before the paragraph's over, clarifying things a bit, you are actually soul plus body. Who you are is determined somewhat more by soul than body, but what you are is soul plus body. Now that's one brief approach to personal identity questions, but there's so much more in Augustine. In the Narrationes in Salmos, the expositions on the Psalms, Augustine talks about the totus Christus, the whole Christ. The church is one person with Jesus Christ, and this is a guiding hermeneutical principle for interpreting the Psalms, but it's also a theory of identity, building on the Pauline approach. Personal identity is determined by the church's unity with Christ. This, as a theological concept from the expositions on the Psalms, I think also should be taken seriously as a component of the Augustinian approach to questions of personal identity. And with that, I will end this video. Thank you for watching. Email me, platoandaugustine@gmail.com, or comment on YouTube, and hope I see the comment there. If you have further questions, comments, objections, requests for reading suggestions besides the Plato.stand for reading. See you next time.